Greetings and welcome back. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. This is session 2 of our big summit, the Race and Justice Imperative. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Alexion Pharmaceuticals, for making today's conversations possible. In our first session, we discussed how systemic racism, how stereotyping, how bias have led to continued injustice for the black community, and basically every community in the United States is basically given a raw deal in this. In our second session, we will discuss how we can rebuild societal structures for equity. As we acknowledge the need for change, we're also going to understand that what we look like and look across different sectors of our society in policymaking and hiring and civil rights and business, housing, education, everywhere in daily life, we need to take a look at all of this. To help us understand how we can make real change, we have an absolutely outstanding lineup of civil rights leaders, change makers, thought leaders, social entrepreneurs. And I'm joined once again by Marty Johnson, the Hill's politics reporter. He's a pretty cool dude. It's first time, Marty. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you're having fun.
It's a great time.
Yeah,
it's great to get out of the house.
It's good stuff. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillBHM, Black History Month, The Hill BHM. We're broadcasting live. We'll take your questions throughout the program. And if you have any trouble with your live stream, just push refresh, and I promise it'll all just be perfect. So I hope it works. Over to you, Marty.
Thanks, Steve. We are joined now by 3 U.S. mayors to discuss approaches they are taking to tackle systemic racism, inequality, and biases in their communities. Each are the first black American to serve as their city's mayor. Stephen Reed is the mayor of Montgomery, Alabama. He was the state's youngest elected probate judge and recently was named to the Department of Homeland Security's Elections Integrity Commission. Melvin Carter is the mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota. Since his election in 2018, as part of his equity agenda, he has raised the city's minimum wage to $15 an hour, expanded immigrant and refugee support resources, and launched an Office of Financial Empowerment. Ella Jones is the mayor of Ferguson, Missouri. Before being elected in 2020, she was Ferguson's first black city council member. We are so happy to welcome all of you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
My first question is for Mayor Jones. The police killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd this past summer sparked national unrest, protests, and we saw the return to national prominence of the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm personally from St. Louis. I was a senior in high school when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson. For you, I think, at least for me, I noticed that this movement seemed different. There seemed to be more staying power. It was harder for people to ignore. So for you, who have gone through both, was personal in 2014, what do you think is different from what we saw last summer?
Well, what is different, we have a lot of our young people have mobilized, and they're mobilized from every group. You have your Hispanics, your non-whites, your brown people. All of them are coming together for one purpose. They have made it up in their mind that they're not going to tolerate the injustice, and taken to the streets as a group of young people, it makes a big difference.
And since 2014, there's been significant changes that have happened in Ferguson. You being elected as the city's first black city council member led to more city council members being black and being on the council. What do you think, what are some of those changes that you've seen?
Well, first of all, the people wanted to have a voice. They were sick, when you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, you get up and do something. So they got up and they went to the polls and they voted. They voted to have a voice. They voted for someone who was going to listen to them, encourage them, and empower them to take charge of their community and stabilize their community. We have seen a lot of entrepreneurs come here to Ferguson to open businesses, but more importantly, the people who live here are working to better their own neighborhoods.
And when it comes to reform, Mayor Carter, George Floyd was killed in your sister city of Minneapolis. The Minneapolis City Council in December voted to divert $8 million from the police budget to social services and violence prevention. What are some things that you've worked, a lot on law enforcement reform. What are some things? Do you have something like that in the mix?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question. And it's good to be here with two mayors who I see as heroes who do incredible work. Absolutely. You know, one of the most, I think, shocking and horrific things about George Floyd's murder was how historically unsurprising it is. And so our work in that space started far before that. Frankly, it's one of the reasons I wanted to be mayor in the first place. And so we're working around what we call our community first public safety framework that says we need a much more proactive approach. If you think about public safety in America, when we talk about our public safety systems, we're always talking about prisons, police, and prosecutors, which none of which take effect until after something terrible has happened. When we think about keeping our children safe, it's all about preventing something terrible from happening in the first place. And so that's our approach, is to one, invest in proactive investments in the people and the places that we know are most likely to be impacted by crime and violence. We've learned in this pandemic that when we identify, and I see gun violence as a pandemic, that when we identify the people and places that are highest risk, those are the people and places that we ought to get the most resources to the quickest. We've learned that, we've rehearsed that in our response to COVID. But then the other piece is changing the dynamic of the police relationship with our community members. One of the things we've seen is that sometimes when people call 911, it's because of some issue of crime and violence, and there's no substitute for a police presence. Most of the time, actually, when people call 911, it's because there's some concern or someone's in crisis in some non-violent, non-emergency, and oftentimes non-criminal thing that people are calling 911 because they need help. And so our goal is to identify, we're doing this work right now, to identify the capacity we need in terms of social workers, mental health responders, chemical health, emergency, housing providers, and those types of things, so we can actually bring the resource that people need to get out of the cycles of crisis, while also freeing our officers to focus on the more acute kind of issues of crime and violence that occur in our community. Again, this is our community first public safety framework, and it's our notion that just responding as quick as possible after something terrible has happened is not at all sufficient to keeping a city safe.
And you talked about getting resources to the people that need it the most. And that's been a large crux and a large problem with the COVID-19 pandemic that has also ran parallel to what's happened last summer. Mayor Reed in Montgomery is providing transportation to vaccine centers for people who need it. Have you seen that as a positive, and how has that helped get people who need the vaccine most the vaccine?
Well, it's been important. Certainly from our end, it's something that we know there are barriers to transportation. We know there are barriers for people getting to the vaccination sites. And so we've been trying to work with private transportation providers, as well as increase our role through our public transportation system to address those needs. But we also are working with churches. We're working with other faith-based organizations, as well as volunteers, fraternities and sororities, and others that are assisting us. But one of the things when it comes to COVID-19 is also educating and informing our community about why it's important to get the vaccinations, to understand some of the challenges that have been there, not only through healthcare disparities, but also through the history of healthcare in this country relative to Black people. And it's a very different story than it is for many others across this nation. In particular here in Montgomery, we're only about 30 minutes from Tuskegee, Alabama, where the Tuskegee syphilis experiment obviously still hovers over the memories of many people, and that's been passed down to generations. So we're trying to overcome that from an information perspective as well as an implementation perspective. And I think learning from mayors like Mayor Jones and Mayor Carter are things that, we try to see what one another's doing. We try to see, are there things that we can do a little bit better to serve our residents here? Because in the end, really, I have no authorship on any of the ideas that I have. I'm only interested in the outcomes. And that's what we're trying to provide as it relates to all of the support that we've given for COVID-19. And if I can just kind of tag on one point to what Mayor Carter brought up, the social services piece is very important when it comes to many of the challenges that we're dealing with, whether it's Montgomery, Ferguson, or St. Paul. And often that gets overlooked. Often we kind of focus on those hard expenses and we don't think of the soft expenses, mental health care, crisis intervention teams. And we don't think about the importance and the impact of those services, in particular for people who do not have health care. So it's important that when we talk about some of the challenges, we talk, at a macro level, but also at a micro level in ways that I think mayors around the country are trying to fill in the gaps that have been left there by, just absence of policy or absence of courage or will.
And you brought up your city's proximity to Tuskegee, where the Tuskegee study happened for 4 decades, and the hurt and the pain that still exists from that study and other studies on the Black community without their consent. When it comes to having a robust education around the vaccine, and letting people know that, hey, it's safe to get the vaccine. This is what you need to do to keep you and your community safe. And this is a question for all 3 of you. What kind of programs do you have along that line to educate your communities?
From my end, what we're doing is we see this as a public information campaign. All of us are first in our cities, and we all bring a sense of political activism to the table. And so we know how to campaign. We know how to touch our voters and touch our residents and try to get information to them. And no different than when we're running for office or we're running to get something on the ballot or to support an initiative, we're using the same approaches from our churches, our social media, our traditional media, of course, and we're using grassroots. We're knocking on doors. We're using those community leaders that know people and can reach people in a way that maybe I can't because they have the trust, they have the bond. So we're trying to take a full-fledged approach to this, no different than we would if I were running for re-election. And we're trying to hope that we can get to even more people that will vote for me that might take the vaccine, because we want to get 100% of residents in Montgomery to do that. And we're trying to use every way possible across the board. And we're using all the talent that we have, from our young professionals, some of our teens on social media, to some of our elders who have more traditional ways of calling their peers and their church members and trying to get the word out.
Well, here in Ferguson, it's 68% African American, and we are in North County. And it has been a very, very slow response to people taking the vaccination. So what we did, we partnered with County Executive Sam Page, open up a vaccination center here at the junior college to have people to come in and register for the vaccination, doing an educational campaign out there, making certain people get the correct information about the vaccine. In addition to that, we put together a stakeholder group, pastors, teachers, lay people, everyone coming together, make certain that education is out there, and having our political leaders, our church leaders take the vaccination on television. I did myself, took it on television. And when I got finished, by the time I made it back to my office, we had taken in an additional 100 telephone calls from people saying, well, Mayor Johnson, you took it, we're going to take it too.
Right.
So it's getting that trusted voice out there. People will follow the trusted voices. And when they know that their leader is taking the vaccine, they will be more apt to take it themselves.
We're seeing exactly the same thing, and we're doing the same things. I haven't received the vaccine yet. We're still trying to get it to our frontline responders, so our police officers, our firefighters, certainly our nurses and teachers and folks like that in our community. But ensuring that we have access to it, and ensuring that people know that they can get it, ensuring that we have the capacity that we need We're a city of 315,000 people. So to get that many people vaccinated, how many do we have to do a week? How many people do we have to do a month? What are our goals and how are we holding ourselves accountable to those goals? I've been frustrated, frankly. My father is a senior citizen, Navy veteran, and had to drive 40 minutes to get his shot in the suburbs. That's not acceptable. And so, we are working hard to bring more capacity online, working with our governor, working with folks to bring more capacity online to ensure that we're able to kind of respond in some of those ways. To your point, though, this has got to be about providing resources and connecting people to the resources that we know that they need. Right now, we've seen across our country homelessness skyrocket.
Right.
We've seen unemployment skyrocket, hunger, social isolation skyrocket. We've seen crime skyrocket, and everybody wants to talk about that, but it really should be no surprise. Those other things I just described are always the factors that have led to neighborhood crime. And so hopefully we're finally at a space, and this I think goes right back to our conversation about public safety reform. Hopefully we're finally at a space where we understand, based on the events that have happened in this last year, crime has gone up because hunger has gone up, because homelessness has gone up, because poverty has gone up, because unemployment has gone up, because of social isolation has gone up. If we want to reduce crime, we need much more than more police officers. We need to address all of those issues which cause the crime to increase in the first place. Right now, our top public safety priority, our top educational priority, our top economic jobs priority is getting shots in arms.
Right. Well, thank you all so much. My colleague Steve has a quick question for you guys.
Hey, everybody. Steve Clemens with The Hill. I've been enjoying this conversation very much. Mayor Carter and I talked a few years ago when I was at the Atlantic. We had Pete Buttigieg on the panel talking about what cities were doing. And a lot of these, I guess the question I want to ask you, and I'm going to try to figure out how to ask this. We do a lot of work with the Conference of U.S. Mayors. And I hear the DEFCON level from all of you is very high on the issues we're talking about. I guess my question to you is, how do you feel other cities, particularly in organizations like the Conference of U.S. Mayors, is this high on the agenda, or is this a marginalized set of issues on the agenda? And then when you kind of look at the things you need to change, I always ask myself, if we come back in a few years, will we have solved any of this stuff? Will we have moved it forward? And I'd just love to get a snapshot, because we have a lot of folks listening. We have folks from the Conference of U.S. Mayors listening. So, does this need to be amped up in that world?
Yes, it is. So mayors are on the front line, right?
Yeah.
No matter what Washington, D.C. does, no matter how politically partisan gridlock you see in Washington, D.C. or at state capitals, mayors are always knee deep in neighborhoods and knee deep with community and face to face with people and families. And so every mayor I know, these types of issues we're talking about are a top priority for. But the thing is, we also have to know that where housing is concerned, where homelessness is concerned, where unemployment is concerned, we operate cities that operate within regions and metropolitan areas. And so a lot of these challenges end up converging into the city. Homelessness is a great example. If you find yourself losing housing in a greater Minnesota area, in a suburb or a rural area that doesn't have housing resources, you go into the city where there are resources. So our cities end up holding with a small amount, a finite amount of local resources, trying to hold up the world for a whole region or a whole state on so many issues that it becomes unsustainable. So I think mayors are focused on this, and I think mayors need more help coming from the federal government, need more help coming from our states to be able to produce sustainable solutions and not just be constantly sort of chasing the problems.
Mayor Reed, Mayor Jones, quick thoughts?
Well, we do need solutions, and we do need them from the federal government, and we need them to the point that they're accessible. We don't have to fill out 200 pages to state that we need aid to people who are hungry, who are homeless, who are facing eviction. If the federal government is willing to help the mayors in the small cities, the big cities, they need to cut out all of that red tape and give us the help that we need now, because the people are hurting now. We have a big food giveaway on Saturday here with the Urban League, and we are expected to serve 4,000 families. That's too many. That's too many. But we need the government to step up and give us the funding that we need without so much red tape.
Mayor Reed, thank you, Mayor Jones. Mayor Reed, quick thoughts. And, I think I love that you're in your car, and thank you. It's great TV.
Thanks. It's one of those where we're in between meetings here, and I'm trying to get from one point to the next. But listen, I'll make it very short. Mayor Carter, Mayor Jones have summed it all up for me. I couldn't agree more, and I couldn't have said it any better than they've just laid it out. And I do think the U.S. Conference of Mayors, as well as the African American Mayors Association, have this at the top of their agenda. And I know the National League of Cities and other groups are working on this as well. But they summed it all up, and I certainly concur with their sentiments.
Well, thank you guys so much. Mayors Jones, Reed, and Carter, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your insight and speaking your truth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next guest has been involved in the fight for racial and social justice for more than 25 years. Van Jones, a name everybody knows, is the CEO of the Reform Alliance, an initiative founded to transform our criminal justice system. He's also an author, a media personality, political commentator, social entrepreneur. Van, great to see you again. So much to unpack and talk about, but you know, if I was gonna add another label, I'd call you Mr. Odd Bedfellows, right? So, you know, you have this kind of unique way of bringing people who would never normally overlap and getting them, you know, I think one of the things we're trying to talk about, how do you get empathy established? How do you get people to walk in each other's shoes? And I'd love to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about how you see the building of empathy, which hopefully leads to trust and understanding. But I mean, you actualize it, and I want our people to understand how you do this.
Well, I appreciate it, and I'm standing on the shoulders of a lot of people who've been doing it for generations. And it used to be more normal for us to say, just because I don't agree with you on everything doesn't mean I can't work with you on anything. And so you know, I've been blessed to work on criminal justice reform. You know, my constituency, people see me on TV, they think I'm a TV guy. That's a very small part of any day for me. Most of what I'm doing is working with the Reform Alliance, working with Dream Court Justice, working with the Ella Baker Center, working with criminal justice organizations I've founded over the years to get people out of prison. My constituency can't vote. They're locked up. My constituency can't march. They're locked up. They can't tweet. So I've got to go out. I can't multiply enemies for them. I can't be Mr. Cancel Culture and tell everybody, if you aren't, you know, where I want you to be, I got no use for you. I've got to multiply friends for my constituency. I've got to multiply friends. I've never met anybody in prison who said, you know, get me out of here. You know, I can't take it anymore. I want to go home. But whatever you do, don't talk to a Republican. They've never said that. They say, get me out of here. And so being grounded through Dream Court Justice and the Reform Alliance and real folks who are struggling has been very helpful. But the other thing, too, is that it turns out that on both sides of the political divide, there are compelling reasons for us to do something to reduce the number of people who are needlessly behind bars. The Republican Party at its best, you know, I'm a strong Democrat, but the Republican Party at its best is a party that's based on liberty, limited government, individual rights, and dignity. Well, the criminal justice system defies those principles every day. You have a big failed government bureaucracy that gets bigger every day and does a horrible job gobbling up money and liberty and rights. So the conservatives at their best have a reason to be at the table. And certainly Democrats, with our concern for racial and social justice, have a reason to be there as well. But you think about that. Liberty on the right, justice on the left. Liberty and justice for all. That's the basis for us to work together. Now, we can fight about everything else. There's no rule that says if I work with you on something on Monday, I can't also work against you just as hard on Tuesday and then work with you again on Wednesday. That's new in American politics, that if I don't agree with you on everything, I can't work with you on anything. The people who suffer under that logic are the people at the bottom. Rich people are going to be fine. They'll go to Mars if they have to. But poor people from Appalachia to the hood, folks on Native American reservations, people in prison, people who don't have much, they get left out when we won't cooperate even to help the least of these.
I began digging into this probably, way back. The Obama administration interviewed Valerie Jarrett, who at that time was very openly working with the Koch Foundation. They didn't succeed in the criminal justice reform. We get to the Trump administration, and you're able to work and find pathways to work with the Trump administration. My question to you is, a lot of people critique the achievements that you got on first steps of criminal justice reform as not being nearly enough. What do you need to see from the Biden administration, and who are the odd bedfellows that you think need to line up to kind of move that a few notches forward?
Well, listen, I agree. You know, the First Step Act was called the First Step Act. Right. It was supposed to be the first step. If that had been the last step, it'd have been a failure. But it was the first step. It kept us in conversation. Obama did a lot he did not get credit for. He did get fair sentencing done on crack, powder, cocaine. His Department of Justice did a great job, but he did not get that big bill done. We were able, surprisingly, to get a big chunk of that big bill done under Trump, which means now you've had 2 presidents in a row that have done something positive on the issue, whatever critiques you may have on what they didn't do. Now, I think we've got to move forward to second, third, fourth steps. Number one, that crack, cocaine, powder cocaine disparity needs to be completely erased and erased retroactively. I think Durbin and Cory Booker are working on that. We need reform of supervision. You know, probation and parole systems are completely dysfunctional. People go back to prison for no reason at all. They haven't even broken the law, but they violated some little tiny technicality. They go back to prison. The Reform Alliance will have a bill on that going forward this year. We need to expunge people's marijuana charges. All of these things. But the great thing about it is there is interest on both sides to do some of this or all of it. I think Biden can do a good job. And I want to shout out dayofempathy.org. Next Tuesday, March 2nd, a bunch of organizations, including Dream Court Justice, are having events in 40 states to bring people together on a bipartisan basis to do something about the criminal justice system. It used to be a bipartisan issue the other way, build more prisons. We finally have a chance to make it be a bipartisan direction the other way, bring people home from prison, reduce the prison population, respect liberty, dignity, rights, and justice, and do it on a bipartisan basis. And I'm going to keep doing it. We can fight on everything else, but for people who cannot vote and have no rights at all, we've got to come together.
Please give the website one more time, Van.
Dayofempathy.org. March 2nd, Tuesday, dayofempathy.org. For people across the country standing up together.
Next week, next Tuesday, you have Rick Santorum joining you?
I hope so. He's actually been helpful on some of this stuff, believe it or not.
That's good. So let me ask you another question. You know, one of the other things I've gotten into is, when everything you're saying resonates, and I know people who have been in prison and look, their FICO scores are screwed. Their ability, they've got, records. When you kind of look at this in a way that this was systemic racism transferred in another way, you have people with ongoing liabilities in their lives that continue to drag them down. So I've been interested in, the algorithms. I mean, it's an algorithm issue. If you're on LinkedIn and you're out there looking for jobs, or, you have people checking out your backgrounds, this is all coming out. So there's some companies like Checker and others that are saying, we need to give people another chance. And it's not something that's often come up in these discussions, but how much are you beginning to talk to those big holders of data, algorithms, and the way they judge and sort us all out, and whether or not they're going to basically be able to begin to expunge, as you said, some of this stuff that isn't getting people back to get another chance, a second chance?
It's a really great idea, and I have to admit, you're educating me. I haven't thought about that. We haven't focused on that. We've been focused more on Washington, D.C. Maybe we should be focusing on Silicon Valley and getting some justice there. So listen, the great thing about a conversation like this is, you start generating ideas, you start generating opportunities. I think people have the wrong ideas. People, I think, in America think that the country's in trouble because we have too many awful people in the other party, too many awful Democrats who are all socialists, or, too many awful Republicans who are all cult members. Look, there's some awful people everywhere. The biggest problem we have is we have so many awesome people in both parties, all races, all faiths, all genders, all sexualities, so many awesome people who just don't know how to work together, who we don't know what to do. But when you start putting the awesome people together, great ideas like that come up and you can get stuff done. And it starts to feel good. I'm high off of getting stuff done with these unlikely bedfellows because I see people coming home from prison, hugging their children, hugging their grandmas, and getting a second chance. Let's keep working on that. And who knows, maybe we can work together on addiction, on mental health, on childhood poverty. There are common ground issues. On the battleground issues, we have to fight. That's a given. But on those common ground issues, We can't only fight and still have a country. Let's find some things we can do together to help people who don't have anything.
Van Jones, I always love talking to you, always love hearing you. Really grateful for your leadership. CNN host, founder of Dream Corps. Say that website one more. I want people to kind of hear it.
Dayofempathy.org. And also reformalliance.com is another place you can go. If you believe
Tuesday,
in
March
people
2nd.
coming together, reformalliance.com, dayofempathy.org. If you believe in people coming together, putting differences to one side to help somebody, come help us.
Well, Tuesday, March 2nd. Van Jones, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And now a message from our sponsor. Please welcome Tamar Thompson, Vice President of U.S. Government Affairs and Policy at Alexion Pharmaceuticals.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, everyone. I'm Tamar Thompson. I'm the head of Government Affairs and Policy for Alexion Pharmaceuticals.
And I'm Uzair Kadir, Alexion Pharmaceuticals Chief Diversity Officer.
So, Uzair, we've heard a lot today about systemic racism and the need for change. And, I think there is a huge underrepresentation in the pharmaceutical community. And I know that we at Alexion are working really hard on this particular topic. Can you talk a little bit more about what we are doing at Alexion to combat these challenges in our healthcare environment today?
Absolutely, Tamar. And this is really a unique moment because for the first time, diversity leaders find themselves in a true driver's seat to address these challenges head on. Now at Alexion, you know this, last summer in 2020, when we had our moment, we realized that not only did we want to trailblaze this change, but that the solutions of the past perhaps cannot deliver answers for a brighter tomorrow. So we decided to, in some ways, reimagine and rewrite the entire diversity playbook in the corporate arena. And the way in which we did that was by positioning diversity at the right level in our organization, to set the tone at the top so our leaders are inspired and energized to drive diversity messaging and agenda into every pocket of our organization. Now, Tamar, you and I both know that alone doesn't cut it. So we decided to frame diversity in a really powerful and holistic way, to talk about conventional elements of it, like race, ethnicity, gender, but also unconventional sides of it, socioeconomic diversity, neurodiversity. And we declared to our employees that each and every one of them is a part of our diversity movement to drive this change. We were able to engage 7% of our global workforce to directly drive our diversity agenda. We created, based on that 7%, a global diversity, inclusion, and belonging innovation factory where these colleagues were rolling up their sleeves every single day to go ahead and innovate new ideas on diversity front related to employee diversity, but to your point, also on patient diversity, to reimagine clinical trials, to reimagine all those solutions. Now, the challenge is that these great ideas and programs can't simply stay within the four walls of our company. They have got to ripple outside of it and throughout our industry.
That's right, Uzair. This is fantastic. I mean, your program has only been in place for 8 months at Alexion, and just imagine what we're going to do in years forward. And to pivot on your point about moving our work external, rare disease patients have a lot in common with diverse populations. Both are uniquely underserved, and underrepresented, and have challenges with health equity. I'd love to talk a little bit with you now about what we're doing inside of Alexion around diversity and inclusion, as well as for our own rare disease patients in clinical trial development. I think this is a great time for this discussion because COVID has really ripped the Band-Aid off of, the need for us to focus on diversity and inclusion in clinical trials, and we now know it's possible. So talk to us a little bit about that and what we're doing inside Alexion.
That is true. The world is transforming in front of our eyes, Tamar. What COVID-19 pandemic has done for us is that it has started to shine light on inequities that exist in an even more, pronounced manner. And I love that you talked about clinical trial diversity. I shared with you that we have a pod on clinical trial diversity. In 2021, we're actually working closely with the research and development organization to set goals around clinical trial diversity, to think through all the things that we have to do in 2021 to move the needle forward on that. Patient diversity has got to take the front seat, because at the end of the day, the patients are waiting. They continue to be our guiding star. And employee diversity is the best way to bring those innovations to our patients.
Fantastic. You, Sarah, I can't tell you how happy and proud I am to be an Alexion employee and get to work with you and your team every day. This is an amazing opportunity for us to represent, not only, as you mentioned, internally, for our employee base, but that work then transcends through to our patient populations. And that's what it's really all about for us at Alexion, is patient centricity. And I have to tell you that for me, in the policy world, it's never been a more exciting time for us to represent not only rare disease patients and the best interest for access and clinical care, but also on the policy front to make sure that patients have what they need to be successful. And our patients' journeys, as you know, are so challenging. In the rare disease community, on average, it's about 7 years to diagnosis. And I think that there's a correlation there with, with minority populations as well.
Absolutely, Tamar. Now, throughout my life, I've had moments where I felt and realized what it's like to be an outsider in a world that's only built for the insiders. I moved to the United States once as a displaced person. No immigration story is easy, but the challenges of pivoting to a new life, not on your terms, is truly dramatic. And at a later point in my life, I once moved to Rome in Italy for over 2 years. And that experience taught me not only how to be an outsider, but how to reinvent yourself very quickly. I know that boxes are for shoes, not for people. We have to take people out of boxes and put them on these beautiful spectrums of uniqueness where they truly belong. When we embark on a quest to do that, we start fanning the flames of belonging and creating environments in which every person can belong because of their uniqueness, not despite of it. Now, you and I can talk for hours, as we always do, but our time's run out. So back to you, Steve.
And now I'm honored to be joined by civil rights leader and humanitarian Martin Luther King III, the oldest son of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. Following in his father's footsteps, his efforts to rid the world of social, political, and economic injustice have made Martin Luther King III one of the most respected civil rights activists in the nation today. It's so great to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let me just ask you, the last time we spoke, we were reflecting on how COVID was hitting different communities in this country. We were in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and other murders in this nation. And we also talked about the economic hits that yet again showed how exacerbated and how wide the gaps were in this country. And one of those biggest gaps is race. You've been at this longer than most folks I know. Are you optimistic at all that we're moving in the right direction? And what would be some of the things we've got to get in place to make more progress?
So, I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic, by the way, even in times where it's very difficult. And I would say the last certainly 4 years have been difficult. But actually, if you talk to many persons in different communities, it has not just been the last 4. The difficulty has existed for quite a long time. It certainly came to a tremendous head, I think, in the last 4 years. But beyond that, though, I stay optimistic because I have to believe in the humanity of human beings. I believe that there's far more good in people than there is bad. And I think we have to find ways to create the climate to bring out the best of who we are. Oftentimes, as it relates to race, some of it may be unconscious bias. In fact, maybe the majority of it is. And when you teach and train people, and I think what I mean by that is, in schools, we need a curriculum that, in my judgments, has, and this, by the way, should start in kindergarten or pre-K, all the way through college, so that you have diversity, human relations, sensitivity, and other types of training and exposure that help you to understand different cultures. Because I think when we understand that every culture is different, everyone has made a contribution, and you're inspired by that training for all those years, we create a different kind of environment for everybody.
Let me ask you, I've talked to a number of other key black leaders, Reverend William J. Barber, Cornel West, others that have said, with the Biden administration in play now, that one of the things they worry about is we've got folks that talk the talk but don't walk the walk, that there's always the risk that the communities that have been marginalized can continue to be marginalized even with their supposed allies in power. I guess what would be your expectations right now of the Biden administration on race and justice?
So I know the president has talked about putting a commission in place to look at the issue of policing. Now, historically, and from time to time, commissions have been great, and I do think it's needed. But a commission with real teeth to make recommendations that are going to be implemented, quite frankly, because it's not just in policing. It really is through, corporate America. Corporate America has to make some major steps around diversity, inclusion. Everyone now has a D&I department. But are you really funding it? Are you focused on it? Leadership has to come from the top. So the CEO, along with the board, must reflect diversity, along with the C-suite, along with all throughout the organization. If we are meant to make these kind of steps, I think people will begin to feel that progress is being made. And then we've got to find ways to address the healthcare crisis. The fact of the matter is Black and brown communities are often the essential workers, but they also have the worst levels of healthcare. We've got to find a way to ensure that everyone is treated with dignity and respect. So I certainly can agree with some who've said, whether it's probably, certainly Dr. Cornel West, maybe Dr. Barber as well, we can't sit on our laurels. We have to continue to challenge and hold elected officials accountable. It's not going to happen automatically, but if people are constantly raising these issues and rising up in a unified way, I think we will make good progress.
Do you feel as if in the appointments that you've seen, of course we have, Kamala Harris as vice president, and you mentioned to me last time we spoke that you saw that as a very positive trend, that many young people of color could see that and feel inspired by it. But are you positive about the appointments and, I should say, the diversity of appointments in the Biden team?
I certainly feel optimistic about the appointments, and I think if all of them are confirmed, it is certainly a diverse cabinet, maybe even more diverse than President Obama had to some degree. So I'm excited about that. But it's, again, how do you get the whole government to reflect that? And how do you get policies and principles? I mean, there's so much that has to be repositioned. A lot of it, the president has started by doing executive orders, but there's got to be legislation because legislation is far more difficult to change. An executive order, a new president can come in and change it. I'm glad we're back in the climate accord. The climate accord is one. I think there's some things around race that have executive orderly been done, but we need legislation. There's the George Floyd Policing Act that was passed in the House, but has not been heard in the Senate. There was the John Lewis Voter Registration Restoration Act, which was passed in the House, but not in the Senate. There's legislation around responsible gun legislation that was passed in the House, but not in the Senate. But with the majority, the hope is that these issues can, in a relatively quick manner, be passed.
I want to ask you a kind of interesting question about what your North Star is. I'm very familiar with the work and contributions you've been making, but, and really living out and continuing to speak to and act on the legacy of your father. And I guess, the interesting question I have is, when do you know when the right time is to negotiate pragmatically in the center to move things forward? And when is it time to take the stand and engage in nonviolent protest and civil actions? Because it seems like to me that you're able to do both of those. And for a lot of people watching and are concerned about race and justice and moving the needle forward, I think it'd be interesting for them to hear what your North Star is and how you decide when those moments are.
So when we talk about what is pragmatic and what, I don't really like labels, but we always characterize, we talk about conservative and we talk about liberal or progressive. And I err often more times than not on the progressive side. Give one example. Here's an example. Some in Congress talked about the fact that those who were talking about defunding the police, because defunding the police is an issue that many people are concerned about, that Democrats lost. Well, the reality is the Democrats that actually won were the progressive Democrats in New York and in Missouri, and I think there's one more seat. But yet Democrats who purported to be right in the middle have lost, and the Democrats lost some, to still maintain the majority in the House I'm talking about. So I think my North Star is when you're doing the right thing, whatever it is that benefits the most people, if it happens to be progressive, so be it. I think we have to take those risks. The time is always right to do that which is right. Or what you really believe is right for the nation. Oftentimes we take positions that are safe. My father used to say the ultimate measure of a human being is not taking positions that are safe, nor expedient, or nor political, but we must take those positions because our consciences tell us they're right. So whenever we do right, if it happens to be progressive, I think that's the time. In some cases, there may be positions that we take that are conservative. Example does not come to mind right this moment, but I think that you always have to hold out for progress. We should be in an era of expansiveness, not exclusion and retracting. And I think the last 4 years we sort of retract in one sense. I think we as a nation have to constantly be in expansion. So people may say, well, you're a liberal or progressive. Well, it's not an issue for me what one may think I am. What I believe I am is I want to do what is right and good and just for all in society. And I'm going to continue to forge forward to, as I said, inclusion. It's not exclusion. We've excluded people. We've mistreated the indigenous population that's been here. Some may call it Native Americans. Some may call it Indians or call them Indians. But the fact of the matter is we had to go back, in my judgment, and recast ourselves so that we treat everyone correct. And we really do need to deal with these areas where we've made grave mistakes. Maybe it's an apology. Maybe it's reparations. Now, some people would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, from my point of view, it does. Reparations have been given for many, some ethnic groups over the years.
Right.
And I think that's a discussion we need to have. And I believe it's actually being discussed in Congress. It was just a few days ago.
Martin, let me just squeeze in one last question here. My folks are going to get upset, but I want to. But I love talking to you about this because you talk about the full picture and you really talk, across all communities. But you also talk a lot about corporate America. We often talk about income inequality and fixing the minimum wage at $15. We're not talking about corporate boardrooms. We're not talking about inclusion at big companies. Do we need to broaden our aperture that when we look at this question of income inequality, and look at it more broadly, because I think you do that. I'd love to get your map, your strategic dashboard of how you address poverty and what the real pathway is forward. Is it really just talking about a $15 minimum wage, or do we need to move way beyond that?
The $15 minimum wage is just one aspect, but it's a significant aspect. There's obviously, rejection on that because small businesses, many of them don't feel they're able to accommodate that level. But the fact of the matter is, we've given subsidy to major corporations for years. It's really interesting. We don't have a problem providing and subsidizing all these huge corporations. but we're not able to help the small businesses, certainly to come up to the $15 level. I think it's interesting, for example, I don't like to be critical of anyone, but in West Virginia, Senator Joe Manchin has a number of people in his community that need to be risen to that level, and yet he's against the $15. But he's for maybe 11 or 12. So he's moving in the right direction. But the fact is, many of these poor communities, Mitch McConnell, Kentucky, one of the poorest states in the country, and the Kentuckians need that. And yet it's interesting that the Republican position is, well, that's way too much. Well, I just believe you have a different standard when it comes to subsidizing, as I said, the large corporations. Why can't we help the small business people? And then we can move the pendulum up. $15 is the first step. It's not the only step. I think there are other things. When you talk about corporate America, it's such a huge area of where there needs to be movement. I talked about earlier corporate boards being diverse, and I think D&I departments are enhanced. They're being, those departments are being increased. When we look at the C-suites, we need Blacks and women, and we need Latinos and Hispanics, and maybe even some other ethnic groups, not in positions of human relations. That's good, but we need marketing. We need all those positions that will move those individuals to the CEOs. When we're able to do that, I think we have a much better corporate structure. We have a much better nation that feels diverse and engaging, and no one is excluded.
Well, human rights advocate Martin Luther King III, I always enjoy our conversations. Thanks for stretching our minds today. Really great to see you.
Thank you, and same here.
For many Black Americans, the American medical and education systems cause trepidation and skepticism because of a lack of trust, access, equal opportunity for the community. To discuss how these entities can be reformed, we're joined by Dr. Judy Lubin, sociologist and founder and president of the Center for Urban and Racial Equity, CURE, and Michael D. Smith, director of Youth Opportunity Programs and executive director, a really cool crowd, My Brother's Keeper Alliance at the Obama Foundation, about which we've heard so much over the years. Really appreciate you both thanking us. And I wanted to say a shout out because we were going to be joined by Akil Ross, who's an education consultant. He was the former National High School Principal of the Year. His broadband's not working out today, but Akil, I promise you, I want to bring you back, and we can continue this conversation because we're not going to do this just in a one-shot today. So thank you so much. I hope he's watching right now. But let me just open this up. As we think both about mentoring young men, and we think about trying to get greater equity and health justice, if you will, in our society. It's really a trust issue in many ways. And, Judy, I'd just love to kind of get your dashboard on how you think about somehow getting those that are skeptical, who feel like the cards have been stacked against them for so long in so many different ways, to finally say, okay, we push reset, we trust the system. How do you do that?
Yeah, thanks so much, Steve, for having me and for hosting this important conversation. I think it's critical that as we're thinking about how do we increase vaccine uptake in the Black community, that we really do think about not just the historical legacy of medical abuse and racism, but also that a lot of the mistreatment and medical bias that people are drawing their decisions around this COVID-19 vaccine is recent, right? People have real lived experience of being disrespected within clinical settings. And so this is something that medical professionals and public health professionals have to build trust, right? That's the work of us to do. I consider myself a public health practitioner. This is how I first started my work. Doing racial equity work is grounded community public health and public education. And so it's our job to not only name and recognize the history, but also to roll out the vaccines in a way that help to support trust. And we like to say equity, you sometimes have to move at the speed of trust, right? And it's a real challenge when you're trying to roll out a vaccine really quickly and you have distrust in the community, right? Merited and legitimate questions that are being asked about the vaccine. And so we need to see really large scale public service education campaigns. I'm hearing people not even knowing that there are vaccines available within their neighborhoods. Like, why isn't there signage available for people to know that there are vaccination sites in their neighborhood? So there's a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of building relationships with trusted messengers, with faith leaders, our barbershops, our beauty shops, our churches, those trusted institutions and community assets in order to distribute the vaccines, but also for people to have their questions answered is really critical, right? That it's not just providing the vaccines, but providing space for people to ask questions.
Judy, I want to go to Michael in a second, and I'm so excited to talk to him because he's also about trusted messengers and mentors, et cetera, which I find so important in this conversation. But I guess over the last year, I've interviewed just about everybody big in the coronavirus story. Anthony Fauci, Robert Redfield, Deborah Birx, and along the way, I would ask them during the point. I said, "What's your communications plan? Are you building in trusted messengers for different parts of the community?" I would always get the message from Jerome Adams, the Surgeon General. Yes, don't worry. We know there's skepticism. We have a communications plan. So let me just ask you, did their communications plan that they said they had, is it working?
Well, I would say it's clear, right, that it isn't working. And I'm still asking where that communication plan is, right? I think certainly since the Biden administration has come into office, we're beginning to see some structure around the vaccine rollout. And we're beginning to see like real clear communication that Black and brown communities are going to be prioritized. But I think certainly a lot more needs to be done, right? This needs to be visible, right? In neighborhoods. We also need to be hearing about it on radio and TV, right? That people know, like that we need visibility around eligibility. So there are all these different phases, right? Populations that are being prioritized. We should know, like, what are these phases? Yeah. When am I going to be able to access the vaccines? There should be a national number that links people to local resources and local vaccination sites. Right. So I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned around how to reach communities of color. I think there are a lot of lessons to learn from political organizing. I mean, we saw a massive turnout just this last year for the presidential election, right? So there are people, right, in our communities, Black women, Black-led organizations that know how to reach folks, and they need to be tapped into, provided the resources in order for us to increase vaccination uptake. I'm so glad you said that because I've been looking for that communications plan too. But Michael, I love My Brother's Keeper. I love what you do in reducing youth violence, mentorship, and it just was such a. Honestly, when you look back at the Obama administration, many things that but this is one of those that you come up and just like both real hard and it did something. And let me just ask you, if My Brother's Keeper didn't exist, what would the lives of many of your students and your young people look like today?
Well, thanks for the question and thanks for having me here. I think the importance of My Brother's Keeper, we're actually coming up on our 7th anniversary on February 27th. My Brother's Keeper was founded after the tragic killing of Trayvon Martin and the even more shocking acquittal of George Zimmerman. And it was really started to say to the nation from the President of the United States, boys and young men of color, you matter. Your dreams matter, your hopes matter, and we need to do everything as a nation to make sure that you can succeed. President Obama talked about at that time that making sure that our young men of color can achieve their dreams is the most important thing that we can do as a nation. And it's not just something from our heart, it's the head. We know if America is going to stay globally competitive, if our communities are going to be resilient, we have to make sure that we're benefiting from the talents and hopes and opportunities of our young men. And frankly, because of systemic racism, because of barriers that exist in education and employment, far too many of our young men were not able to reach their full potential. So because of My Brother's Keeper, there is now a network of hundreds of communities across the country where you have city governments, businesses, nonprofits, all working together to make that pathway from cradle to college and career and beyond much clearer, and to have real honest conversations about how racism shows up in that, how gender bias shows up in that, so we can disrupt those systems that are no longer working. Let me ask you, because as we're thinking about change right now, one of the things I told my team when we put this program together, I didn't want to just check off the box and say, oh, it's Black History Month, let's do a program. I really want to kind of elevate and talk about things that we continue to keep our eyeball on, that we can, and we have been doing this very consistently every month, more and more programs along these, social and economic and really health justice issues across the way. But being embedded in a presidential administration helps, doesn't it? I mean, it certainly helps. As a then a younger man of color than I am now. Even though I was working on the My Brother's Keeper initiative, I stood in the back of the East Room of the White House when the president was announcing My Brother's Keeper, and I had tears running down my face. And I remember hiding a little bit because I was standing next to a uniformed Marine and I wanted to appear manly. But I remember how much that meant to me growing up in a school system. I was in a busing program where I was called the N-word. I remember at the time feeling that there were dreams that I couldn't achieve. I remember still myself being first. You know, my grandmother grew up in the segregated South, and so it mattered that the president of the United States was saying, you know what? Race and gender is at play here, and we've got to do something. We've got to get to the root causes and see what we can do, not just have a conversation about race, not just figure out how we can take some kids to a baseball game, but let's study the science. Let's look at the research and let's see what we can do to break this horrific trend that we're seeing. So it mattered. And in the Obama administration, we had 22 federal agencies and White House offices that were moving policy, ban the box, second chance Pell, chronic absenteeism, all was changing as a result of My Brother's Keeper. But the other thing that I think we found was important is it gave air cover for mayors and small towns and business leaders to say, we can talk about race too. We can do something about this problem. And today, 7 years later, we still have hundreds of communities and thousands of partners that are making a difference for our boys and young men and their families.
It's such an important story. I love this story. I hope you're going to come back and talk to me. I want to give Judy the last word in this. We never have enough time because I love your program and I want to learn more about Judy's. But Judy, I would say, I just asked this question about being embedded in this administration. We talked to Maxine Waters and Barbara Lee earlier, both of whom seem optimistic. They said, we've got, people of color in important positions, women of color in important positions. We have the President of the United States talk about systemic racism in his inauguration address. Excuse me, folks. What I guess I want to ask you is, do you feel, as you're looking at getting essentially a reset and a reordering of, I don't know how to put it, winners and losers, so that there are more winners, you expand the pie of those that benefit and that are included in a healthy track, do you think the White House is part of that now, and do you have the tools you need?
I think the White House is certainly a part of it, but we'd love to see the administration go further, right? We need bold, transformative policies that really get at the root of structural racism and structural inequities in this country. So we'd love to see Democrats in Congress and love to see the Biden administration get on board on some of those policies like a federal jobs guarantee, right? Particularly in our communities that are being hardest hit by COVID-19 and experiencing economic distress, right? That we need a federal jobs guarantee so that anyone who wants a job can have a livable, a job that pays a livable wage, and that they're able to take care of their families and themselves. And this is critically important for our communities, for us to be thinking about the recovery in a way that's going to be equitable, to ensure jobs, to ensure there's affordable housing, right? We have an affordable housing crisis across this country that particularly impacts Black communities, right? We're only 13% of the population and 40% of all homeless persons in this country. And so housing is a major issue and can be used as the center or a cornerstone for our equitable recovery and infrastructure building plan.
Well, it's so great to talk to both of you. I hope we can do more of this. Judy Lubin, founder and president of the Center for Urban and Racial Equity, CURE. Michael Smith, director of the Youth Opportunity Programs and executive director of My Brother's Keeper, the MBK Alliance, and the Obama Foundation. You're both doing great work. I'm really happy to have just heard. I just feel like, wow, some of this stuff is so heavy, but I feel like you're both making a big difference. I'm really grateful for your time today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Inspired by the 2016 presidential campaign of Senator Bernie Sanders, Stephen Garza, then a 14-year-old, volunteered on political campaigns in Texas, and he became a leader of the Texas Student Democrats. There's a film, I just watched it last weekend, called Boys State, one of the top documentaries of last year. Garza is profiled with other Texan boys of various backgrounds and races during their week at the American Legion Leadership Experience. Really happy to be with Stephen. Stephen, are you there? Hey, good to meet you. You got to I'm not used to seeing you with a mustache, my friend. So great to see you. I want to tell everybody this film, which I was sort of skeptical of when I first heard of, Boys State, whatever. It is a fantastic movie. I highly recommend people see it. I'm on the opinion page of this, side of things, so I can say that. I'm looking at my colleague Marty, who's not. But Stephen, I love this film, and I just want to ask you and tell the folks that what this was about. And we essentially have thousands of 1,200 or so young men brought together by American Legion to go through essentially a political convention, rival groups, and elect a president. And you went through that process, and it seemed to me a little bit like Lord of the Flies at some points, a little bit like racism and homophobia and all sorts of gunk was part of that story. And then you rose to incredible prominence. You didn't win. But I would love to kind of hear what you think the tectonics are of that story that our audience should understand and know.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. Boy State is a film about the next generation of Americans tackling the issues of our day. It is about young people working together regardless of political ideology or party to do what's best for their state and government and their country. And that's, I think, the message of the film is that we young people realize, I'm 20 years old now and I was 17 at the time of the film, that those people in Washington right now, the adults, the senators, the Congress people, it doesn't seem like they're going to fix the issues, and that we are going to inherit the problems of Washington. And although many of us at the time couldn't vote during the time the film was created, we knew that we had to be part of that process of healing this nation, of working together, regardless of labels, and get things done on behalf of the American people, something that we felt that the politicians in Washington were not doing.
Stephen, I got to ask you just a movie question. I know a lot of people haven't seen it yet. Please go see it. How did they film this? Because I never had the sense that any of you were looking at a camera, but I don't know how. I mean, just tell me the insider scoop on how they filmed this thing.
Yeah, so directors Jesse Moss and Amanda McBain, really, really good friends of mine now, are used to working with a crew of one. It's usually Jesse who's out in the field filming with a camera over a period of 2 years. And Boy State was filmed with a crew of 28 people, 7 cameras, and in 6 days. And they knew that if they didn't capture it as it happened, then it was gone forever. So it was just really amazing and seamlessly to watch the camera crews dance around. And for us subjects, it's like a little bit of getting used to having a camera following us around. I had a camera on me from 7 a.m. to close to midnight some days. And, we're there to build this government. We're there to run for office and talk to people. And the camera was really secondary. I mean, it just really faded into the background, especially since teenagers, have cell phones now and, have a camera that's probably just as good as any film camera now. So it really was just blended into the nature of the program.
Well, thank you for my movie wonk question, because I want to know. But let me ask you another thing. When I saw the characters that they were following around at the beginning of the show, I thought you were, a sweet kid and you were genuine and earnest, but I thought you didn't have a chance once you got a sense of some of the things pulsating that we also saw. Pretty blatant racism, pretty blatant, wrapped around, a lot of other issues, in the era of Donald Trump. And you captured the imagination of people of your, I think you were the nationalists, right? And the chairman of your committee, Renee, who was going to join us today, unfortunately, he is stuck in a lot of the stress right now with weather hitting and the displacement of that in Texas. But, there was an effort to impeach this young man, in part racist. My question to you is, there seemed to be a battle going on in the movie between those who wanted to have values and wanted to make a difference, and then others that were purely Machiavellian. Any issue was expendable, and all you needed to do was really to win. And I'd just love to get a sense, as we sit in Washington, D.C. today, where we saw an assault on the Capitol on January 6th, we have been discussing white supremacy issues today on today's program. We talked about systemic racism. And how do you get values to be the thing this political system is chasing as opposed to hiding? I'd just love to get your sense of that. And do you see it the way I did?
Definitely. And that is the forces. It's the forces of those who want a different path of politics. Politics is a dirty word. Politician's a dirty word. It's almost synonymous with corruption, with deceit, with Machiavellian tactics, and puppet mastering and all those sorts of things. But me and Renee were both in the racial and political minority at Boys State. Out of the 1,000 kids who went to the Texas Boys State program in 2018, the vast majority of them were white and conservative, and we knew that running. And me and Renee ended up being elected. Despite of that, elected to the chairman of the party and myself, the Nationalist Party nominee for governor. And I think it's because that those kids who disagreed with us, who didn't look like us or come from the same background or maybe didn't hold the same views that we did, really did want to end that partisanship and gridlock that has faced Washington. And at the time, in the June of 2018, we didn't think that the country could become more polarized. And I think every single student there would have been shocked to see what happened on January 6th, and that the fact that this country seemed to be at its breaking point. We don't ever want that to happen. We really want to have a country for us to be able to live in and thrive in, and for us and for our kids and their kids. It's more evident that my generation realizes this at a very young age, that the decisions that are being made in Washington are going to affect me 20, 30 years from now. The Supreme Court justices, federal court justices, all these, legislations and things that are passed are going to affect me 20 years old, when I'm 30, 40, 50 years old. A lot of us realize that, and we wanted to make sure that we are able, as the next generation of leaders, politicians, entrepreneurs, small business owners, teachers, workers, that we're able to constructively and proactively have these discussions that are hard. Politics isn't easy. Compromise isn't easy. Working together isn't easy. But we know that the alternate is, we saw a glimpse of what the alternate was on January 6th, and we're going to make sure that doesn't ever happen again.
We're getting close to the end, which is sad for me because I would love to talk all day. But did you ever sit down with Renee, who I should tell our audience is an African American young man, and then also I don't remember his name, but the campaign or the chairman of the Federalists on the other side, who was an amputee and had physical handicap. The three of you, and you were very open about your mother having been an undocumented immigrant into America. That each one of you were starting with kind of a card stacked against you in a way. And I'm just interested in whether the three of you, one of them was your political rival, but did you ever talk about what gave you strength from that amidst this sea of other, white, Second Amendment hugging, just very different crowd in Texas, I should say. I mean, I love Texans, but it was just it was odd to see the three of you rise in that.
We never had a discussion of that. I mean, I got to work with Renee a few times throughout the week when I wasn't campaigning, and I only ever interacted with Ben once during the entire week. Ben being the Federalist Party chair, and we're all friends now, and but during the week, I mean, we all had something to prove. We weren't going to let what we look like, what we're can and can't do. I mean, myself. Not the textbook definition of what a politician looks or sounds like. Being in that racial political minority, me, Renee, and Ben all had different reasons to prove to this group that we're they're equals, and that we could do it better than any of them could. And I think that's evident in the fact that Renee and Ben rose to be the chairs of their party, and myself became the gubernatorial nominee. It was to prove, that we were worth just as much as anybody else, and we walked away feeling that way.
So you're a student at UT Austin. I'm just going to ask what I'm sure everybody else does, so it's not original. But are you going to stay on this track? What do how are you going to stay in this effort of engagement? What are your aspirations?
Definitely. I'm a student at UT Austin, of course, and I'm studying political science. I hope to continue pursuing politics professionally. I'm looking forward to being on the campaign trail once I graduate all across this country, electing people that I believe in, and hopefully serving with them in government one day. So I'm very looking forward to that. All the boys from all the subjects from the film are pursuing public service in one way or another. Renee is focused on the activism. Ben hopes to continue working and end up in a position with either the State Department or the Department of Defense. and Robert right now is at West Point serving, getting ready to become an officer in the Army. So
yeah, Robert was hilarious.
We all love this country, and we all hope to serve it in one way or another.
Robert was hilarious. I'd love to meet him one day. Well, when you come here and you make it to town and you're elected to something, I promise you the Hill will cover you and will be tough but fair.
That's all I ask for. Thank you so much.
Steve, great to see you. Thank you so much. Our next guest is the Distinguished Professor of African American and Diaspora Studies at Vanderbilt University. He's also a New York Times bestselling author of more than 20 books and a well-known media and cultural commentator on just about every bit of national TV and radio in the nation. Michael Eric Dyson, it's an honor to have you on our show today. Thanks so much for joining us. So I've been trying to I have read so much of what you've written, and I know that the audience that needs to hear some of what we're talking about today are those who are least concerned with race and justice in America, right? Mm-hmm. That's the challenge of the time. I thought a little bit about, I spent a lot of time in Japan and witnessed a lot of historical amnesia in Japan about its own relationships with its neighbors. What do you think are the best antidotes to historical amnesia in this country about these questions of race and divides and systemic bigotry in this country?
Yeah, that's a great point. Usually people say, hey, you're preaching to the choir. And I say, well, the choir needs rehearsal as well. Just because you're in the choir doesn't mean you don't need to know what the song is like, to practice what it's going to sound like in service. The altos don't sing the bass part. The bass doesn't sing the soprano, and the like. So preaching to the choir is exquisite practice for presentation of ideas and singing of songs, so to speak, to an audience that might hear it freshly or might hear it differently. And what difference does that make? Well, in answer to your question, it could be that we have to keep going back at it. Those who are victims of amnesia, historical amnesia, forces of dismemory, so to speak, that preclude them from understanding differently their situation, their complicity, their view of the world as either helping out or hindering. And I think one of the things we do is to continue to try to make inroads into such communities through analogy. Like you feel when, that's how we feel then. So if you can try to figure out to bridge the experiences of, in some instances, what appear to be bipolar oppositions, camps that are, bitterly divided, at least using the bridge of common experience works too. To give you an example, Martin Luther King Jr. was in jail in Birmingham, 1963. And the white jailer came to him and said, Dr. King, what you're doing is absolutely wrong. That integration is not the thing. We should all be segregated. He said, no, I think I'm right. They went back and forth. And he finally said, how much money do you make? And when the jailer told him, he said, well, you need to be out here marching with us. So there's a way in which we can say, look, some of the stuff you're interested in, we're interested in. You're interested in your kids getting a better education, so are we. You're interested in a better wage for your job, so are we. But the way to do it is not to think that I'm your enemy or that black people or brown people are your enemies. Let's band together. Let's join where we have common cause and make an argument in behalf of both of our societies, societies, communities, and camps, and it makes a difference. It may not work, but even if it works a little bit, it opens up the door of possibility that some of that amnesia can really be rejected, and in its place, some serious historical memory put.
That's powerful. I think joining up is a powerful message, but I'm going to read from my phone here because I've got it here, but you in your very powerful Tears We Cannot Stop, a sermon to white America, there's this line, I love it. It says, empathy must be cultivated. The practice of empathy means taking a moment to imagine how you might behave if you were in our positions. Do not tell us how we should act if we were you. Imagine how you would act if you were us, and on and on. Imagine living in a society with white skin, where white skin marks you for disgust, hate, and fear, and on. Sometimes I've done events with people that are diametrically opposed in position, and in the middle of the event, I had them walk in each other's shoes to change positions and argue the best points of the other side. This empathy thing seems to be a huge issue today, and so I'm just wondering, to go a little bit further than joining up, how have you found, what's the best track to get people to understand what it is to feel, to be in someone else's shoes so that they can really generate real empathy?
Yeah, well, your methodology there is quite brilliant. because it forces people to make arguments in behalf of positions they might not naturally be inclined to support. Beyond that, I think, and on that line, but a bit further up the road, so to speak, is when something happens to somebody and then the light goes off. For instance, a lot of people now are, because of COVID and the pandemic and this novel coronavirus, are out here, waiting for checks for $1,200, $1,400 and whatever. They're going to food banks in ways they never did before. And they say, look, I'm hardworking, I'm intelligent, I've fallen on hard times. You can see it's not my fault. This is a systemic and structural problem. Aha. This is not dissimilar to what happens to many African American and Latinx people and other minoritized people who are, because of systemic barriers, prevented from flourishing. Except it's not just a pandemic, it's an ongoing thing. Can you imagine that the pandemic is going on for years and years and decades? So you begin to say, not only walking in another person's shoe, when it happens to you, when the pain, when the trauma, when the heartbreak, when the economic downturn affects you, then understand what goes on in other communities that don't have the promise that the pandemic will be over one day and that they'll be restored in their former economic status, or that they will somehow have the remedy for their particular trauma delivered to them. I think that's another way we can at least build some inroads there.
Let me ask you a political question, Dr. Dyson. I think it is just a fact that both Republican presidential administrations and Democratic presidential administrations, even the Obama administration, all of that has gotten us to where we are today. We still have, seen murders, George Floyd, others. You wrote a letter in your recent things to Emmett Till, to various victims of violence, Eric Gardner, Sandra Bland, and others. And so I'm interested in the fact that part of our government, which with Joe Biden talking about race, trying to make equity an issue, that this is all part of the legacy. What would you expect them to go above and beyond the talk right now to make a real difference when it comes to race and justice in this country, so that we don't just have this ongoing story, well, we tried?
Yeah, that's a keen observation on your part, because Democrat and Republican presidents, parties, have basically done a game of musical chairs where they're running around the chair as the music plays, but they're vying for the same seat. Get a different seat, play a different game. And in this sense, what I would want and expect and hope from Biden, first of all, he's the first president to mention white supremacy in his inaugural speech. And then secondly, systemic racism. Now, you could argue, well, because of, quote, white privilege, he had the ability to talk about race in a way that, say, his former boss, Barack Obama, didn't. All right, we'll concede that, even though, as I tried to do in my book on Obama, I tried to push back on him and suggesting that there were many more things he could have done. But having said that, I think that when it comes to the very situation and circumstance you already mentioned, police brutality, Daniel Prude's, the grand jury has decided not to press charges to the detriment and chagrin of citizens around the nation. Ahmaud Arbery, not a police killing, but a vigilante killing 1 year ago, that occurred. And then when we think about the anniversary of George Floyd coming up in May, and then the trial beginning next month, there's a lot of stuff going on. It all mostly happens to have something to do with policing in America. Stop the discourse. Stop the anti-bias training. It's not working. Stop the cameras that are on their bodies. They turn them off. This is why an effective way of shifting resources from one arena to another. Public safety is not the exclusive preserve of the police. And only about 5% of their duties involve the kind of extreme violence and aggression that we see manifest so routinely in many communities of color. That means that we've got to put more money behind people who deal with mental health issues, who are capable and competent of therapeutically intervening in a hostile situation, and not reducing that person that is being dealt with by the police as a cog in their police machinery. So I think the real argument, whether you believe in defunding the police, a stronger community oversight that has real teeth, that could impose some constraints and some penalties, and let's be honest, The unions associated with policing across this country are exorbitantly empowered, all out of proportion to their numbers in the community. And then finally, if we can figure out a way to deal with qualified immunity, if you can't deal with it legally, because the Constitution guarantees that people who are representatives of the state cannot personally be held liable, you can figure out a legal way to come at that. But also, if we begin to put funds in other arenas of public safety, the power of those police departments becomes extraordinarily diminished in an appropriate fashion.
Let me ask you finally, Dr. Dyson, the other question that has been churning in my head for years is, what do you do to rectify the inequality, the not only decades, but centuries of built-in discrimination? I've interviewed Anthony Fox when he was a mayor ages ago and looking at how transportation went in, and it just screwed some communities. Guess what? They were black and brown communities. And you kind of look at the legacy of there. You look at redlining and financing homes or businesses, or having stores or food deserts. Guess what? Black communities and brown communities. You look at incarceration rates, the drug economy that was out there, et cetera. You look at the way black and brown people ended up in jail, and white kids, same crimes, didn't. I used to work with Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he's talked about reparations, as many have. But I guess the question is, when you look at that legacy of just a ball and chain, excuse the metaphor, around a whole bunch of Americans and not around others, I know there's no quick fix, but I just would love to get your insights on how we begin moving that forward in a credible way, and where so-called white America, those in there, understand that has to happen for society to get healthier. Does that make sense?
It's a great point. A couple things that pop to mind. First of all, treat black people like you treat white people. And what do I mean by that? As Ira Katznelson in his book, When Affirmative Action Was White, said, the GI Bill was basically an act of affirmative action in a broad sense. We can even say reparations for the hurt and the pain and the trauma that these soldiers endured in foreign theaters of war, returning home, mostly white. Some black people got advantages, but mostly white citizens. And what did they get? They get tests, points on a test to go to school. All right, great. Right. They got, extra loans for housing, powerful. And they got a boost up in terms of getting a job. Well, my God, in practical terms, that's what we're talking about. People who made sacrifice get compensated in some way. And how it gets worked out, we can talk about that. You've named several areas. Those are rehearsals for reparation. The way in which reparation, will be doled out, that's a different story. People can begin to argue about that. But the notion that you can steal somebody's furniture, steal up their house, and then when they claim they want some of it back, you go, hey, that's too long. It's about 100 years ago. We've built a bunch of mansions around that housing. Your people who are your legatees are just out of luck. If we can just have a simple moral approximation to what experiences have hurt and harmed us and how those have been done to black people in this country, we might at least begin to think about it. I'll end by saying this. Martin Luther King Jr. said, a nation that has done something special against the Negro, as we were then called, for 250 years, has to do something special for the Negro now. And he suggested, as the National Urban League had, a Marshall Plan for the inner city. There are multiple tributaries feeding into the great river of reparation. We just got to figure out our will to do so.
Well, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, Vanderbilt University, and you're the guy I consider the eyes wide open guy. And I want to thank you for helping me to have some semblance of a beginning of understanding and empathy for some of these issues. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, and you're doing a heck of a job, my friend.
Thank you, sir. That brings us to the end of our program today. Thank you to my co-anchor, Marty Johnson, for being up here with me today, the Hill's politics reporter. Read his stuff. Big thank you also to Alexian Pharmaceuticals for supporting today's conversations, and to all of you in the audience for joining us. For those of you who missed any of these conversations, we're going to have all of this up on our event website shortly. I'm Steve Clemens. Be well.